Hi, I'm Liska Turner, and welcome to the Leadership Series, where every month I get the privilege of sitting down with a leader from the charity not-for-profit sector and talking all things leadership. Like many people, 2020, I've decided to mix things up a little bit. And I had this great idea to sit down and have a chat to a chair and a CEO and just really explore the relationship, because as an exec recruiter in the charity space, I've had a bird's eye view of this relationship for a long time, and I've seen where it's worked and I've seen perhaps sometimes where the roadblocks are. The tricky thing, it's something that actually not a lot of people want to talk about publicly. So a very big thank you to my guests today, Michele Adair, Chair of CHIA, Community Housing Industry Association New South Wales, and CEO of the Housing Trust, and Mark Degotardi, the CEO of CHIA. They very bravely agreed to have an open conversation today to share their learnings, their thoughts and their opinions. So welcome and thank you very much for being here.
All right.
Pleasure.
So we're going to kick it off, and I'm going to go to you first, Michele. What three words would you use to describe an effective working chair-CEO relationship, and why?
Trust, teamwork, and disclosure. All of which, of course, are intimate related. You know, you can't have trust in a relationship unless you've had a history of that. And that, I think, particularly in the context of the chair-CEO relationship, when I use the word disclosure, which was one of my other three, it's around, you know, that lovely old adage, which I think many of us have heard, don't surprise the boss. And although the whole board, of course, is jointly and severally responsible and equitable in the sense of the relationship with the organisation, and particularly within the context of the relationship with the CEO, that opportunity to be able to really say, from the chair's perspective, let me know, give me the heads up, what's happening, and to have the trust to know that your CEO will do that is vitally important. And then absolutely teamwork, in terms of, you know, as chair, what I can do to support Mark and the rest of his team, and what we can do together to support the board in their obligations.
So now, Mark, you don't need to agree with her, but what are your words?
Agreement, and agreement. No, look, they're unsurprising.
Performance review.
Unsurprisingly, not too much different. My three were transparency, respect, and communication, and for sort of the same reasons that Michele has already outlined. I mean, I really am a big subscriber. I think you can pleasantly surprise the board from time to time, but don't ever unpleasantly surprise them. And that's about having a culture in your own team about making sure that, you know, things do go wrong in organisations, and that's okay. The worst possible thing you can do is to try and pretend that things didn't go wrong. And what a board wants to know is what happened, how do you intend about going to fix it, what resources might you need to help you fix it, how have you stopped it from happening in the future. So you know, that's the kind of conversation you need, and that's why for me that transparency piece is really important. Respect for me, I think, is really critical, and I think it's particularly true for industry associations. I have the great pleasure of having a large number of CEOs who sit on my board. So
you're a lucky man.
And so, look, it's really, really important that we both respect each other's roles and where those boundaries are, and that, you know. And we haven't had to have this conversation, but if we did, you know, I could sit down with Michele and go, you know, I think I need you to pull back, or she could say to me equally, actually, we're just holding you accountable and we're going to keep asking the questions. So I think that kind of stuff is really important. And the last is really just about how you go about doing that and the way you communicate with that board. You know, and for me, it's absolutely critical. That's a really clear path. I would hope that Michele never hears anything about my organisation that she shouldn't hear from unless it's from me first. Equally, if there's stuff about me that the board wants to say, my trust in Michele is that she's going to be the one to tell me. So that's really important.
And yes, I have you know, I've placed people in jobs where they found fraud and the board didn't know. So let's hope everyone does what you do. You know, my next question is around what are the pain points? And this is probably what people often go to. So in answering, if you can think of maybe some good things as well, because I don't just want it to be about a negative dynamic, because we all know that when this works, it makes such a difference to, I think, that the overall health of an organisation. But Michele, to you, what do you think the pain points are?
In the relationship particularly?
Yeah.
Look, I think, and as Marcus said, I am one of those chairs who also wears the CEO hat. And so I think for me, the biggest pain point is either personally, I hope I don't do that very often, or when I have board director colleagues who get a little confused about the governance role versus the operational role, or when we're, you know, completely convinced that the way we see the world is the way everybody sees the world and the way things should be done. So I think that's the most common one. And I do think perhaps sometimes, you know, there are differences, not just in peak industries, but in membership-based organisations where there is a lot at stake. And it is critically important in meeting our directors' obligations to, you know, to step into the boardroom and unequivocally always make, you know, decisions in the best interest of the organisation, knowing that there may be times when that might not sit entirely comfortably or perfectly for you as a member. So I think that's vital. And then I think probably the other pain point would be around really understanding the risk tolerance and the nuance of that in decision making, where, you know, as individuals, we have different risk appetites. And for some people, being incredibly bolshy and out there is a very comfortable and almost an expectant place to be. Yet for others, it's a much more cautious. As a chair, one of my critical contributions to every board meeting and all of what happens in between is making it really not only safe but critically important that my colleagues are able to express the diversity of not just their risk appetite but of expertise and of perspectives. But I think that particularly in relation to decision frameworks and issues on risk is important.
I was talking to a chair about exactly that today through the hiring process. So we were talking about it in the lens of the candidates that they were interviewing and the risk profiles that they presented. So what are your thoughts, Mark?
So look, I'm lucky and unlucky in a way that I work in a sector, and as you know, Liska, but obviously the listeners won't. I've worked in a variety of roles in non-government and in the more commercial sector, and what I love about our industry is that there's not a person on my team, not a person on my board, or a person who works at very senior levels in the CHPs that we represent, who doesn't have a passionate view around housing and how to solve it and all of that stuff. And that's fantastic. It's a real joy. But you're mad if you also don't recognise it as a potential problem. And by that I mean that you know, I've come into a sector where Michele and others have, you know, decades and decades more experience than me. They're probably going to know more about some aspects of housing than I'll ever know. But that the challenge is to gently sometimes remind them that we're running an industry association, not a community housing provider. Our role and our priorities are different. The way we need to go about our business is necessarily different. But finding the right way to engage and to take that passion and to have those more challenging engagement, I think that's probably one of the pain points, particularly for industry associations. And
actually that I had never thought about that beforehand, that the the things that you think about, Michelle, at the Housing Trust versus an industry association are by nature different. So you talked about the passion, Mark, you talked about when things go wrong. So I always ask my CEOs when I interview them, the board's role in culture, and they're like, yes, it's very important. But actually, how does the board practically contribute to culture? How do they practically establish the benchmark for culture in an organisation? Because I think it's one thing to say and another thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I would say, I actually think getting culture right is one of the more challenging roles for all of us, boards and CEOs alike. And I think one of the risks that we face into, and one of the things that we've both got to avoid, whether that's a CEO or the board, is to say something and do something else. And look, I would take an example for a process we're going through at the moment with our reconciliation action plans, and it's fantastic to see that our boards really wants to be engaged in our second phase of the RAP. Now, the worst possible thing the board could do now is say to me, we want to be really engaged, and then not engage, because my team will see this, they'll know this, and commentators and others around will say, what's up, why isn't your board more engaged? And so I guess from my perspective, the way you combat that is not just to say you want to be engaged, but actually become engaged. What we've done as a small step to making sure that is that we're actually accountable to each board meeting for our progress against our reconciliation action plans. And so I think that's part of the governance process. It's where our board can play a really important part about saying, actually, exec team, we're making you accountable for this because we really do care about it and we do really want to get it right. Is one.
Okay. Michelle?
Look, I'd certainly agree with everything Mark's just described, and I think our process in a reconciliation action plan is a good example. I think at a micro level, particularly again as chair, the way I facilitate conversation, the way I try and juggle how far do we go in a conversation, do I individually draw out someone to have a voice who may be perhaps less overtly inclined to contribute to a discussion? How do I engage individual members of the executive team when they're participating? What do they see? What do they feel? Do we as a board have informal opportunities to engage, whether it's coming together, occasionally for a meal, downtimes in chat, popping into the office, those sorts of things. And I think even perhaps more formally in my role as chair, but also as a non-executive director, those opportunities to experience culture when you're not discussing culture on the agenda, when it's hanging out over a cup of coffee, when it's just walking around, when it's hearing that a member of the team of the staff team has experienced a personal loss or is doing a great job, and so just flicking off an email or jumping on the phone and saying, awesome, thank you, or thinking of you. Again, simple things, but in that context, I think, by our very nature, we have to maybe make a little bit more effort to do those things when we're on a board, because our engagement is obviously far less frequent, but I think it's as critically as important.
And I think one of the other things, it's also the behaviour you don't walk past as well, which I'd imagine as a chair could sometimes be challenging, because you're in a group of peers, aren't you, sitting around that table? So is that hard to do? Like when you're sitting there all as equals and there's behaviour you don't want to see?
Well, it's like any situation, I think, at that point. You don't I've got to say to my colleagues who may be seeing this, it's never happened at our board table. But you don't call people out on the spot. You sort of have a conversation after the fact. That is as true to again Mark's earlier point around respect. That's as true as hey, listen, I noticed during the meeting that we seem to get a bit stuck on something, or I've noticed, there might have been a number of meetings that you've been unable to attend. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do? And again, I take my responsibility as chair, very, very important, within that context. First and foremost, it is up to me to manage and to be able to support a really constructive dynamic. I heard a wonderful expression, and again, I have not experienced this at all in my time on the board at CHIA. Mark, I hope your experience as our CEO is consistent. But I heard a lovely expression about, as directors, we are obligated to ask questions, to seek to ensure that our executive, our whole executive, not just our CEO, has thought about the options, is giving us the best recommendation, have considered the risks. And there's a lovely expression which I unashamedly copy, but I don't take credit for. And that's asking a question to find your executive in, not asking them a question to find them out. So the difference, so the difference is, I've got a curly question and I'm going to ping you because I don't think you've thought about this, or I don't think that you've considered it, or I'm more clever than you. That's asking to find them out. Whereas when you ask a question to find people in, your assumption is that everything is prepared. Your expectation is that the thoughtfulness has been there and that they're wonderfully capable and their ongoing contributions are constructive. And if by chance there's a bit of a something to tweak, well and good. But the fundamental premise is to find them in.
Okay. So that's a little bit of a segue, Mark, and I'd like to ask you this question. One of the criticisms or the difficultiness of this is, what is it? Hands out, noses in. There's an expression, I've got it the wrong way around. But from your point of Mark, I mean, and I'm going to ask you this question first, but how do you get the board to engage in a way that respects that you are the one running the business according to the delegation that they've given you, the strategy, the way it's been operationalized, so that you have that visionary leadership and that you have a role to play as a, how do you find that, how do you manage that line?
Yeah, look, so I actually think CEOs have quite a responsibility to do that. And I think when it goes wrong is when boards feel like they're operating in a vacuum, or there isn't the transparency, or there isn't the accountability. Because by your actions as a CEO then and the executive team, you invite the board into your space. Whereas if you are, if the board is confident and has trust in what they're being told about the business and the operational issues, then I think most boards tend to want to focus on the strategy, and you can lead them there and have really powerful discussions. Doesn't mean you're not accountable. I mean, boards ask us all the time, rightly so, what's going on here, what's going on there. But I think the point Michele made earlier is the way that you approach that accountability piece is really important as well, because I had the great fortune to listen to a senior leader in the US corporate scene from a couple of decades ago, and his view was, if the problems aren't being raised, then there's nothing for us to work on, as opposed to brushing the problems under the carpet, and I really think that's right. If you can find your board and the exec team in that space, and so our role is to make sure the accountability is there, the transparency is there. And then we can then, by doing, set the agenda for what the board does want to talk about. And in my case, I think the board would much rather talk about strategy of how we're going to deliver more social and affordable housing in New South Wales than talk about, the lesser aspects of the balance sheet or the P&L, frankly. So.
No, that's good. I am mindful of time, so I'm going to move along to my next question. So I'm reading.
Can I just add two other quick things, Liska? One is it's to do with the way the board papers are actually written. Board papers need to be written for a director. They are not written for a management team. So they need to talk about issues of materiality, strategy, risk, and they need to talk about governance and compliance. And too often boards get bogged down in operational reports and whose team's doing this and that and what else is something else or other, and it's at the wrong level. So I think critically in keeping the board up, it's about that. And it also related to that is the frequency even of board meetings. In my experience, the more often a board meets, the more often you end up trying to fill in an agenda, and the more often that becomes operational. And that's not the space in which the board and the CEO should be functioning.
Thank you for that. So thinking about, you mentioned risk and governance, and so COVID, this was COVID's COVID, right? 2 years of unprecedented business. I'm reading Holly Ransom's new book called The Leading Edge, and she poses the question, how are you preparing for tomorrow today? How do boards prepare for tomorrow today, and particularly through the lens of risk? Because, some readings that I've done is that conversations around risk and risk frameworks and thinking about the unimaginable type of things actually brought home that boards need to do that piece of work. Thoughts?
I think we have shifted several gears actually in different ways as a consequence of the last couple of years. I think things like, have we got a business continuity plan, have suddenly taken on a whole new different meaning and consequence. How we continue to refine and understand and adapt, and what it really means to be flexible. What does it really mean to trust our people to work from home when we can't see them? And in parallel with that, how do we meet our work health and safety obligations? What are we doing to look after the mental health of our team? So I think for me, if anything, the experience of the last couple of years has been a wonderful reminder and a reinforcement of some of those bigger values, cultural pieces that we should have all been doing, but have now, come into stark reality. Whether we do or not have a great resignation in Australia, in large part, organisation specific, depends on how have those organisations actually been engaging and looking after their people for years. You can't suddenly invent a culture of support and respect and flexibility. That stuff is built over considerable periods of time. So I think how do we build for the future? I would say the answer to that depends on, well, what's your strategy? As an organisation, what does that look like? And then let's continue to embrace what we have, I think, been challenged to really think about in the last couple of years, and how do we keep the best of that, and how do we continue to challenge ourselves and each other about staying capable to respond, and again that lovely expression of the best is the enemy of the good. How do we make decisions accepting that we will be tweaking again potentially next week or the week after, but sometimes incomplete information, no time to really, finesse it, road test it. Let's just get on with it and accept the fact that most of the time making a good decision is going to be more than adequate and a whole lot better than stalling and delaying.
Mark, your thoughts on risk?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, having come in a former life from the banking industry,
Yes.
relatively familiar with risk in that sense. But so look, a couple of things I think I would say probably to the not-for-profit sector. The first of all is there's no point having a business continuity plan unless you know that it works. And you ought to get it out of the drawer from time to time, because what did the pandemic tell us? That the unimaginable sometimes actually happens, and so, you can't prepare for every aspect of what might happen, but you want to kind of maybe road test your frameworks a little bit. Second thing I would say is your risk document needs to be a living piece of work, and not again something you identified all the risks in 2014 and what you're going to do to respond to them, how you're going to ameliorate it all. Because that ain't going to cut it. And so you need to be kind of constantly updating that and reviewing where you stand. The third thing that maybe I would say is just a little slightly more positive than that is that when the proverbial hits the fan for industry, sometimes you get to make quick decisions on that are forced upon you, and you come to the realization that actually you can take a little bit more risk in your business with good outcomes. And I think that's if we've learned anything as an organisation, only speaking about CHIA New South Wales right now, is actually we can take business decisions more quickly with a controlled amount of risk and have good outcomes from it. And we've got a couple of really good examples in the last 2 years for us.
I think, and I'd say that, from the conversations that I've had broadly, I think that's been a learning. You just need to iterate. My next question is actually for you, Mark, and Michelle, you may want to swap hats just for this one. But the thing that I've always found interesting is when a board is not functional. And I'm not talking about the chair board, maybe this is just more of a hypothetical, and in your past life, possibly, how does the CEO influence change? To me, it's one of the hardest things. If you have a board that's not working, or they've got a constitution that requires them to vote the fact that they'll have defined terms, how do you influence change? What do you do?
Yeah, look, and it's it's quite difficult, particularly if you don't have a relationship of trust that already exists with your chair before that happens. And so, reverting back to earlier, that's why that trust and relationship is so very important. But aside from that, and perhaps it would even involve your chair in the worst case scenario, it is quite difficult for a CEO. But what I think is important is that you try and bring back the conversations and the decisions to the things that boards are supposed to be talking about: the strategy, the accountability of the CEO, the risk management and governance aspects. And if you can't keep bringing that to so stop playing the man or the woman to use sporting vernacular and bring it back to the issue. The second thing I think you can do in that space is try and encourage the board to bring in trusted advisors from elsewhere to give a bit of light and disinfectant perhaps to what's going on. And if it's really, really dysfunctional, I think a lot of CEOs would say, well, if they can't sort it out at the board level, a strategic level, how likely are we to achieve our strategic objectives, and what am I doing here?
Yep. I think that's a fair. So, Michelle, I'm going to ask my next question to you then. So you talked about trusted advisors, Mark. So what role do board consultants have, or what role do they play?
I think it depends on the nature of the time and the circumstance of the board. I think probably the most common is around board performance evaluation. I think that's a critical piece. I've engaged consultants to actually run workshops around improving board papers and helping to really fine tune expectations and clarity and structure. Again, I think a common thing I've heard as sitting at the board table is, I'd like the reports to be different, but I'm not sure how. or I've never heard any director say I wouldn't like shorter reports, but then a CEO, when you go to take them out, it's just like, well, what don't you want? So I think, again, facilitating workshops around getting shared understanding and agreement and buy-in to some things like that. And of course, I think probably the other common one is the facilitation of strategy workshops or particular discussions on a particular issue where you want all of the directors as well as your CEO and other execs, if they're present, to be able to freely contribute without necessarily trying to drive and manage the meeting at the time and the agenda.
Would you add anything else to that, Mark?
Only just don't leave it till the board's at war. Use independent insight and expertise on an ongoing basis. So two reasons. One, you might never have a problem because you've used independent expertise. But secondly, if you do it normally as a routine part, it won't cause friction at the board when you bring them in. So, it would be the only thing.
Timely. Do you think it's necessary for all board directors to have governance qualifications?
I'll go first if you like, Michelle. So I think it's really important that boards have a broad set of skills and you judge those skills across the board, no question. And as always, all boards will have people who are really good at certain things and others who are good at other things. I think you need a baseline understanding of what a board is, what the responsibilities are and the legal framework that sits there. If you're asking whether you need to do a specific course, and I'm not sure whether we're naming names here, but
it's interesting because the AICD course, it's been for a long time the gold standard, but the Governance Institute offers alternative options, and there are other organisations, can't think of what they're called right now, and let's be honest, at nearly $10,000 a pop, there are some volunteer boards that can't make, companies that really aren't in a position to suddenly drop the better part of $100,000 on governance education, and then there are individuals. I mean, if we're going to make our boards more diverse, then we can't necessarily expect everybody to have that discretionary income to invest in it. So that's why I'm just interested in your thoughts, because it's something I get asked for.
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess my personal view on that is that I think that actually the AICD course is a pretty good course, but doing an AICD course won't fix a problem if you're a non-functioning board or a director that doesn't understand their responsibility. It won't fix that, and so I wouldn't say it should be mandatory. And I think something needs to be done about the point you raised, which is accessibility for NFPs and others to that level of qualification, because it is prohibitive.
Look, there are two ways that you can become, qualified as a director. One is through experience, and the other is through perhaps, a formal course of study. Neither of those things makes you necessarily a good director. But I think when you again have a look at the composition of a board, you do, I think, want some people who have had the benefit of some formal study, because I do think it changes the lens, but you also can gain a lot of that insight by being an experienced director and having done the job in other organisations, preferably over a considerable period of time. And I think in fact my first governance training was, in fact, and we're clearly giving the organisation a bit of a plug, was a 3-day not-for-profit directors course that was run pro bono by the AICD as a part of their investment in good governance more broadly. And so, those sorts of things are good, but it's also not about tick a box. I mean, and my own director's ongoing professional development, I've done cyber courses, quite recently. I continue to do, courses in risk management. I continue to engage. So it's not just about doing it once and imagining that that's all there is.
Yeah.
It's about continuous exposure and engagement.
So one of the things I've been thinking about here at Beaumont, I think, as you both know, we've an investment in mentoring, and you've been supportive of it. But one of the things that I've been thinking about, is there a role, board mentors, because to your point, Michelle, and both of you have said, it's not just a piece of paper or experience, because they both bring different things. Do you think there's a place for board mentors?
Yes, absolutely. And I think a part of that is also, in fact, when you're looking at having directors join a board, is the opportunity to potentially, attend as an observer or attend a meeting or participate in committees and kind of learn the ropes that way. And so I think there are a range of, dare I use the word again, strategies that a board can and should use to consider how to continuously refresh and update the competence and capability of directors.
Mark, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I do think it's important to give people a little look-see or window into the boardroom. And it can be quite helpful to understand what it's like and what people are actually doing in those rooms. I think it's equally important, though, that, and this is a topic for another whole conversation, but we need to broaden out the diversity of our boards more generally, both in the NFP sector, but particularly in the big corporate sector. It's just not what we're seeing. It's too insular. It's not good. It's not good enough, and it's not going to be good for long-term governance and health of our organisations.
No, I don't think you get much disagreement with that one. Now, to my viewers, I did pose a last-minute question to Michelle and Mark that they did not prepare for, which is, what's the most valuable piece of information or advice that they've received, and how have they paid it forward? Who would like to go first?
I can, because that's what a good CEO should do, charge over the top first. So, so let me have a crack. I'm completely unprepared for this answer, but I'll have a swing. The most important thing, well, I don't know. It was a very important piece of advice for me, and it's along the lines of, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room kind of advice, and but it really is more about the CEO's role, or in fact anyone in a management role, not fearing the fact that at one point and another someone in their team wants their job, and in fact it's really important that you foster that ambition, prepare people for that very eventuality, and what's been said to me is that it improves the experience and the skills of the people who work for you, and that improves the organisation over time. That doesn't mean you have to give them the job, but preparing them for them. And it was helpful for me when I was a younger bloke, and I'm hopeful that we instill that in our teams as well. That it's okay. In fact, it's great that you aspire to be something more, and that the organisation will support you in that ambition.
No, I've had another CEO say the same thing. I'd rather have fabulous for a shorter period of time and want them for my job and encourage them to go somewhere else, because we are all better for it. So, Michelle?
Look, I think for me, it's probably about keeping your eye on the long game.
Yep.
It's about, from an organisational governance perspective, that translates very directly, of course, to sustainability. How much how much have we got on the balance sheet for a rainy day, for another COVID. It's about who have we got coming up through the ranks that can fill in for our CEO while they're on leave. What are we doing about understanding dynamic changes and risks and patterns in our operating or our strategic environment. So it's also about not sweating the small stuff and about trying to prioritize and spending time, again, very much within the dynamics of the board meeting. How much time on the agenda are we actually spending focusing on the things that we're really supposed to focus on, rather than having the conversation that we might enjoy, or want to grapple with, but is it really strategic? So I think for me it's about thinking about the long game and playing out there. So how do you play it forward? Opportunities, you mentioned mentoring before, making ourselves available to be able to have conversations. I'm sure Mark and Liska, you certainly, I know I do, get people wonderfully, randomly often, flicking me a private message on LinkedIn, hey, would you mind, I've heard, can I, and just a generosity of spirit. I don't know everything, that's for sure. And I'm always incredibly humbled when somebody thinks I may be able to, have a 5-minute conversation that might be helpful for them. And so I think
that's the common theme with what you've both said, is about that generosity. For my 2 cents worth, my bit of advice, and it talks to your diversity point actually, was just because a mentor said it to me once, just because people don't like, comment or share doesn't mean they don't see. And I think that's the thing about diversity. If you're and being promoted, if people don't see the long game, or if they don't see diversity, or if they don't see succession planning active and visible, then they assume that it's not happening. So I just want to say thank you so much. You've been complete stars for my very first one of these. So thank you for your contribution to leadership and your investment in the sustainability of our sector. You two fabulous leaders. I really, really appreciate your time today. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye.